You wake in the quiet darkness before dawn, not with a start, but as if sleep simply thins and lets you go. The air inside your small timber cottage is cool and still, holding the memory of night. Under a fine layer of ash, the embers from last night's fire still breathe a faint orange glow, each small coal pulsing softly in the draught that slips beneath the door. You move without hurry, easing your feet to the packed earthen floor, where the chill rises through the soles of your feet like a slow reminder of the world outside. The fire needs coaxing, so you kneel and take a handful of dry straw from the basket by the hearth, pressing it gently against the warmest ember until a thin wisp of smoke curls upward, and then, with the quietest crackle, a flame catches and spreads. You feed it twigs, then a split log, watching the fire take hold, and in a few minutes the room begins to gather light and warmth, the shadows retreating into the corners. Your thoughts turn to the village feast tomorrow, the gathering on the green that comes once a year when the hay is in and the days are longest. As the village alewife, your part in this is as steady as the turning of seasons. You brew the small beer, not the strong ale reserved for weddings or the sharp perry that comes later in autumn, but a light, nourishing drink meant for everyone, from the oldest grandparent wrapped in shawls to the smallest child still unsteady on their feet. It is a drink of daily life, low in spirits, gentle on the stomach, brewed to quench thirst and carry the taste of grain and herbs through a long afternoon. You think about the tasks ahead as you dress, pulling your linen shift over your head and then your long woolen kirtle the color of brown eggs. Over that you tie your apron, the linen softened by years of washing in stream water and beating on flat stones, the fabric now as supple as a second skin. The apron strings wrap around your waist, and you tie them in a simple bow at the front, the ends hanging down against your skirt. The small ritual of tying the apron settles your mind, marking the boundary between sleep and the quiet work of the day. The cottage around you is simple and known. A single room with a hearth at one end, a narrow wooden bed pushed against the wall, a table of rough planed oak beneath the one window, and shelves of clay pots and wicker baskets holding the dry goods of your trade. The walls are wattle and daub, the timbers dark with age and smoke, and the thatch above is thick enough to muffle the sound of rain. Through the open door, which you unlatch and push wide to let the new air enter, you see the world outside just beginning to take shape. The skies are pale grey, the colour of unwashed wool, and along the eastern edge a thin wash of lemon yellow shows where the sun will eventually climb. The grass in the yard is heavy with dew, each blade tipped with a clear bead of water that catches the low light. A few birds stir in the hawthorn hedge, their calls sleepy and irregular, the kind of song that seems to be as much a yawn as a greeting. You stand in the doorway for a long moment, letting the cool air brush your face. The scent of damp earth and cold leaves mingles with the wood smoke from your own chimney, and from somewhere further down the village lane comes the faint homely smell of someone else's morning fire. The world is still half asleep, and you feel yourself part of that slow waking, your own pulse unhurried. There is no need to rush, because the brewing will fill the whole day and much of the next, and each part of the process takes exactly the time it takes, no more and no less. Eventually you turn back inside and go to the corner where your brewing tools are stored, taking inventory with your eyes and your fingertips. The large mashing tub, its oak staves bound with iron bands, rests upside down on a pallet to keep the bottom dry. You lift it, feeling the solid weight, and set it upright, running a hand along the inside to check for any roughness. The wooden paddle with its long handle and flattened blade leans against the wall, darkened from countless hours of stirring. You find the strainer basket woven from willow, the squares of coarse linen cloth folded neatly, the iron pot suspended from its hook over the fire. Everything is as it should be, clean and dry and ready, and this small certainty is as comforting as the feel of a smooth stone in your palm. Now you take up the wooden yoke that leans just inside the door, its curved shape worn to fit the shoulders. 2 empty buckets dangle from leather thongs, their interiors still damp from yesterday's use. You settle the yoke across your shoulders and lift the buckets clear of the ground, adjusting to the balance, then step out into the lane. The path to the village well is packed earth, beaten hard by the passage of feet and hooves over generations, and in places the ground is lined with flat stones laid to keep the mud at bay. Your own footprints join the countless others, a faint impression in the damp soil that will disappear by midday. As you walk, the birdsong grows slightly more confident, a series of 3 descending notes repeated over and over from somewhere in the high branches of an alder. The sky continues to lighten, the grey now touched with the palest pink near the horizon, and the air holds the coolness that will vanish as soon as the sun clears the tree-tops. The well sits at the crossing of 2 lanes, a low circle of stone with a wooden cover that you slide aside, the wood rough under your fingers and beaded with dew. A bucket of its own hangs from a rope wound around a simple windlass, and you lower it into the shaft, paying out the rope hand over hand with a motion so familiar that your mind can wander while your body performs the task. The bucket descends into the darkness, and after a long pause you hear the hollow splash that echoes up the stone walls, a sound that seems to come from another world. You draw it up again, the wet rope dripping, the windlass creaking softly with each turn, and when the bucket reaches the top you tip the clear water into your own waiting pails. The water is so cold it numbs your fingertips, and you pause to cup a handful and drink. It tastes of stone and deep earth, faintly sweet, and it washes the last feeling of sleep from your mouth. You fill both pails, replace the well cover, and lift the yoke again, this time heavier, the water sloshing gently in rhythm with your steps as you begin the walk home. The weight of the water is a steady presence on your shoulders, a grounding pull that makes you conscious of each footfall. You pass the cottage of the wheelwright, its door still closed, and the long low byre where the milk cow lows once softly. A cat crosses the lane ahead of you, a grey shape that melts into the hedge without a sound. By the time you reach your own door, the sun has climbed above the line of oaks on the eastern ridge, and its light spills across the grass in long golden bars, turning the dew into 1,000 points of light. You set the yoke down carefully, unbending the stiffness from your back, and carry the buckets inside one at a time. With the water safely stored in a tall clay crock, you turn your attention to the barley. In the pantry, a small room off the main cottage that stays cool even in high summer, you find the crock of dried barley grain saved from last harvest. The crock is tall, glazed a deep brown, and its lid fits snugly, sealed with a strip of linen soaked in beeswax. You work the lid free and set it aside, and the smell that rises is clean and grassy, with a faint sweetness like hay drying in a field. You plunge your hands into the grain, letting the kernels run through your fingers like dry sand, and the sensation is pleasingly monotonous. The barley is pale gold, each kernel firm and smooth, and as you scoop and pour it from one palm to the other, you keep a watchful eye for any stray husks or small pebbles that might have escaped the threshing. A few bits of stem, pale and papery, float to the surface, and you pick them out with the tips of your fingers, dropping them into a small discard bowl. A single tiny pebble, grey and round, clinks against the clay, and you set it aside. This sourcing is unhurried, a task that could not be done quickly even if you wished it, because the grain must be clean before it meets the mill. You measure the grain into a large wooden bowl using a simple turned cup that holds exactly one portion. You count under your breath as you pour, a quiet murmur that becomes a kind of chant, 1, 2, 3, and on until the bowl is heaped with enough grain for the batch of small beer you plan to brew. The sound of the barley falling from the cup is a soft pattering, like light rain on thatch, and the rhythm of it settles your mind into a calm, narrow focus. When the measuring is done, you cover the bowl with a linen cloth and carry it out to the main room, setting it on the table near the quern. The quern is a hand mill made of 2 flat stones, the lower one fixed and the upper one pierced with a central hole for the grain and a wooden handle for turning. It sits on a low wooden frame that raises it just enough for a bowl to fit beneath the spout. You pull up a stool and sit, settling your feet flat on the floor, and pour the first handful of barley into the central hole. The upper stone is heavy, and you grasp the handle with both hands, beginning to turn it in a slow, steady circle. There is a moment of resistance, then the sound of the grain cracking and crumbling, a low grinding shush, shush, as that blends with the crackle of the hearth fire. The millstone turns, and coarse flour speckled with bits of husk begins to gather in the groove around the stone's edge. You brush it carefully into the waiting bowl, the powder soft and warm from the friction, releasing a stronger scent now, nutty and toasted. You pour another handful of grain, and another, turning the stone in a rhythm that becomes automatic. Your shoulders learn the motion, a slight forward and back, and your mind drifts gently without going far, tethered to the simple sensation of the stone's weight and the grain's transformation. The room fills with the scent of crushed barley, a smell that reminds you of harvest days, of the sun on the fields, and the dusty chaff floating in the golden light. Outside the open door, the morning continues to unfold, the shadows shrinking, the birds now fully awake and singing in earnest. A soft breeze moves through the cottage, stirring the loose hairs that have escaped your braid. The world feels peaceful and contained, reduced to the circle of the millstone and the warmth of the fire and the steady beat of your own heart. When the last of the grain has been ground, you lift the bowl of coarse flour and examine it in the light from the window. It is uneven in texture, a mixture of fine powder and larger grits, just as it should be for a small beer that will be strained and boiled and fermented. You cover the bowl again and set it aside, then pour a cup of water from the crock and drink it slowly, feeling it cool your throat. The work so far has taken longer than you might think, measured not by the movement of a clock, but by the gradual shifting of the light across the floor. A patch of sun now touches the leg of the table, and you watch it move almost imperceptibly, a quiet sundial marking the passage of the morning. You tend the fire, adding another log and adjusting the iron pot on its hook so that it hangs lower, closer to the flames. The water inside the pot is what you will use for mashing the grain, and it needs to heat slowly because the right temperature is something you feel rather than measure. You dip your elbow into the water every few minutes, waiting for the moment when it feels comfortably hot but not scalding, a sensation somewhere between the warmth of a sun-warmed stone and the heat of a bath. While the water warms, you prepare the mashing tub, lining the strainer basket with a coarse linen cloth and setting the whole thing over a clean collecting tub. You move through these preparations with the ease of long practice, your hands knowing where each tool is kept, your body finding its way around the small cottage without thought. The morning has now fully arrived, the sky a clear, pale blue, with only a few high clouds drifting like sheep in a distant pasture. You stand once more in the doorway, looking out at the lane, at the roofs of the other cottages with their threads of smoke rising straight up in the still air, and you think again of the feast to come. The long tables will be set on the green under linen awnings, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread will drift through the vintage. Children will run through the grass, and the old men will sit in the shade and tell the same stories they tell every year, and everyone will drink your small beer, the cool, mild liquid slipping down easily, leaving no heaviness behind. The thought brings a quiet contentment, not pride exactly, but a sense of belonging, of doing your part in a way that asks for no fanfare. You return inside and check the water again. This time, the skin of your elbow registers the right warmth, a heat that will coax the sugars from the grain without scalding it. You lift the iron pot from its hook using thick cloths to protect your hands, and you carry it to the mashing tub. The water pours in a smooth arc, splashing into the dry flour and turning it instantly from pale gold to a rich brown, the steam rising to fill your nose with the smell of warm bread. You take up the wooden paddle and begin to stir, a gentle circling motion that breaks up any clumps and makes the mash as smooth as porridge. The paddle moves through the thick mixture with a soft, sucking sound, and you maintain the rhythm, circling, circling, while the steam wreathes your face and the cottage settles into the deep quiet of the morning's work. Time passes without hurry. You let the mash rest, then stir again, the intervals dictated by a sense internal and calm. Outside, the sun climbs higher, the day growing warmer, but inside the cottage, the thick walls and the open door keep the air pleasant. You wipe your forehead with the back of your hand, then return the paddle to the mash for another series of slow, even circles. The light through the window catches the motes of flour dust drifting in the air, each one a tiny spark, suspended and then gone. The world beyond your door seems very far away, the sounds muffled and few, a distant dog barking once, the cluck of a hen, the faint rustle of the thatch as a sparrow alights and departs. At last the mash is steeped long enough, and you scoop the wet grain into the strainer basket, watching the amber liquid begin to drip through the linen cloth into the collecting tub below. The drips start slowly, individually, a steady plink, plink, plink that echoes in the wooden tub, then gradually merge into a thin stream. You stand and watch, your hands resting on the edge of the tub, as the wort collects, its color like weak tea, its smell faintly honeyed and promising. The dripping is a sound that asks for nothing, and you listen to it as you might listen to the sound of rain on the roof, letting it fill your mind and empty it again. And so the first part of the brew is done, the grain transformed, the water and fire and time all woven together into this sweet liquid that will slowly become beer. You stretch your shoulders, feeling the pleasant ache of the morning's labor, and you step outside again to feel the sun on your face. The village is waking fully now, and you can hear voices in the distance, a door closing, a child laughing. But here in your own yard, under the wide morning sky, the world is quiet, and the day still holds all its hours gently, waiting to be filled with the next slow task. You go back inside, add another log to the fire, and begin to prepare the herbs for the boiling that will come after the dripping is complete. Your movements calm and methodical, your mind as clear and still as the water you drew from the well at dawn. The morning has moved along in its quiet way, and as you stand by the mashing tub watching the last of the amber wort drip through the cloth, you become aware that your water crock is nearly empty. The iron pot you used for heating the mash water sits dry and waiting, and soon you will need fresh water for the long, gentle boil that will steep the herbs and finish the brew. So you go to the corner and lift the wooden yoke from its resting place against the wall, feeling its familiar weight settle into your palms. The yoke is a simple thing, a length of smooth ash wood curved just enough to fit across the shoulders, with leather thongs hanging from notches at each end to hold the buckets. Generations of hands before yours have worn the wood to a silky polish, and as you run your thumb along the grain, you can feel the slight hollows where shoulders once pressed. You hang the 2 empty buckets from the thongs, their rope handles loop securely, and you test the balance by lifting the yoke just off the ground. The buckets swing gently, empty and light, their wooden staves dry and faintly fragrant from their last thorough scrubbing with sand and water. You settle the yoke onto your shoulders, adjusting the position until it rests comfortably on the curve of muscle and bone, and the buckets rise clear of the floor. The weight is negligible now, just the dry wood and the leather, and the anticipation of water. You step out through the doorway into the lane, and the change in light and air is immediate, the cottage's dim warmth giving way to the broad coolness of the outdoors. The sun has now climbed well above the oaks, and the sky is a high pale blue, streaked with thin clouds like combed wool. The dew has dried from the grass, except in the deepest shade along the hedgerow, and the earth underfoot has gone from damp to merely cool, firm enough that your feet leave only the faintest impression. You turn left toward the well, beginning the familiar walk, and the yoke rocks ever so slightly with each step, a movement you absorb without thinking, your body adjusting as naturally as it does to the rise and fall of breath. The lane unfurls ahead of you, a winding ribbon of packed earth bordered on one side by a low stone wall, and on the other by a hawthorn hedge that has grown tall and thick over many years. The stones in the wall are grey and brown, covered in places with patches of pale green lichen that spreads like spilled flour. As you walk, your free hand brushes the tops of the stones, feeling their cool roughness and the occasional smooth spot where a sheep has rubbed. The hedge is alive with small movements, sparrows flitting from branch to branch, a blackbird rustling in the undergrowth, and the air carries the clean green scent of leaves and the fainter earthy smell of soil still moist from the night. The bird song that was tentative at dawn has now become a steady background music, a tapestry of chirps and trills, and the occasional liquid warble that seems to hang in the air a moment longer than the rest. Your feet know this path so well that you could walk it with your eyes closed, and in fact you often do walk with your gaze turned inward, noticing without noticing the slight uphill slope where the lane passes the old ash tree, the place where the ground dips and a plank bridge spans the drainage ditch, the spot where the hedgerow thins and you can see across the common field to the dark line of the woods. Today you let your mind drift as your body moves, thinking not of any one thing, but of the shape of the morning, the slow accumulation of tasks that will carry you toward the feast. The yoke creaks with each step, a soft, musical complaint of wood flexing against wood, and the sound is so rhythmic that it becomes a kind of metronome, marking the passage of the lane in measured beats. You pass the wheelwright's cottage, its door now open, and you see the wheelwright himself sitting on a low stool outside, a spoke shave in his hand and a long curl of pale wood spiraling down to his feet. He looks up and nods, and you nod back, neither of you breaking the silence, because words at this hour are not yet needed. Beyond his cottage the lane widens slightly, and you pass the village bakehouse where the smell of baking bread leaks from under the door, a rich yeasty warmth that mingles with the outdoor air and makes your stomach remember that you have not yet eaten. Further still you pass the long low byre, and through the open half-door you can see the brown cow standing placidly in her stall, her jaw working in a slow sideways grind as she chews her cud. The sound of her breathing is deep and even, a soft whoosh of air that seems to match the pace of your own walking. At last you reach the crossing of two lanes where the well sits, a low circle of stones that has been there for longer than anyone remembers. The stones are grey and massive, each one shaped roughly and fitted together without mortar, and their tops are worn smooth by centuries of hands leaning on them as you are leaning now. The wooden cover sits in place, a heavy disc of oak with an iron ring set into its center, and you grasp the ring and slide the cover to one side, the wood scraping against stone with a low grumble. The opening beneath is dark, a perfect circle of shadow, and you lean forward just enough to feel the cool air that rises from the depths, a breath of underground that smells of wet rock and ancient earth. Far below you can see a faint glimmer of light reflected on water, a tiny silver coin that trembles slightly as if stirred by some unseen current. The well bucket hangs from a rope of twisted hemp that passes over a wooden pulley set in a frame of heavy timbers. The bucket itself is smaller than your own, made of oak bound with iron, and it has a round stone tied to its handle to make it sink more readily. You take the rope in both hands, feeling its rough braided texture, and you begin to lower the bucket into the well. Hand over hand you feed the rope, the pulley squeaking in a high, thin voice, and the bucket descends into the darkness, until the rope goes slack and you hear the familiar sound, the hollow splash that echoes up the stone shaft like a single clear note struck on a distant bell. You pause for a moment, letting the bucket fill completely, the rope swaying gently as the water finds its level, and then you begin to draw it up. The wet rope is heavier now, and it grips the pulley with a soft hiss while the bucket rises by increments, each pull bringing it closer to the light. When it clears the lip of the well, you reach out and steady it, the water brimming and crystal clear, the surface trembling with the motion. You pour the well water into your own buckets, first one and then the other, tilting the well bucket carefully so that the water arcs smoothly without splashing. Each of your buckets fills with a soft gurgle, the water rising past the halfway mark and then nearly to the top, where it rounds slightly above the rim, held by its own surface tension. The water is so cold that the wood of the bucket chills immediately, and when you dip a finger in you feel the sharp bite of underground cold that numbs the tip. You lower the well bucket back into the depths for one more draw to top off your pails, and the whole process repeats. The same sounds, the same motions, the same cool air rising from the stone throat. When both pails are full to your satisfaction, you slide the wooden cover back into place and take a moment to rest your hands on the sun-warmed stones, looking out across the village. From this small rise you can see the rooftops of the cottages, their thatch a patchwork of gold and grey, and the thin columns of smoke rising straight up in the motionless air. Beyond them the common green stretches out, already dotted with a few figures moving slowly, setting up the trestles for the feast or spreading fresh rushes. The fields beyond the green are a checkerboard of green and gold, the hay newly cut in some and still standing tall in others, and the whole scene is so peaceful that you feel your shoulders drop, the tension you did not know you were holding releasing into the quiet air. A pair of doves wheels overhead and settles on the ridge of the nearest roof, their soft cooing audible even at this distance. You lift the yoke once more, but this time it is heavy with water, the buckets pulling down with a satisfying solidity that makes the wood creak in a deeper tone. You settle the yoke on your shoulders and feel the weight press down, a steady downward pull that makes you stand a little straighter to balance it. The walk home will be slower now, each step measured so that the water does not slosh over the rims, and you begin the return journey with a careful, rolling gait that keeps the bucket steady. The yoke creaks with every step, a sound like the quiet rocking of a cradle, and the water catches the sunlight and throws it back in shifting patterns on the inside of the bucket lids. The path home seems slightly different when you are carrying a burden, the familiar landmarks passing in a different rhythm because your pace has changed. You notice the way the ash tree casts a dappled shadow across the lane, its leaves rustling with a sound like distant rain. You notice the small patch of wild thyme growing at the base of the stone wall, its tiny purple flowers releasing a spicy scent when your skirt brushes against them. The blackbird that you heard earlier flits out of the hedge and perches on a fence post, watching you pass with one bright eye before flying off toward the orchard. The lane is still mostly empty, though you see the baker's boy carrying a tray of loaves toward the green, and an old woman sitting on a bench outside her door, her hands busy with a drop spindle that turns and drops and turns again in a rhythm, as steady as your own walking. As you approach your cottage, you feel the weight of the water more keenly, a pleasant ache spreading across your shoulders and down your arms. You are glad when you reach the door and can set the yoke down carefully, first kneeling to lower the buckets to the ground and then straightening with a long exhale. The relief of the weight is immediate, a lightness that makes you feel for a moment as if you might float. You carry the buckets inside one at a time and pour the fresh water into the tall clay crock, hearing the hollow glug gas the level rises, and you fill a smaller jug to keep near the hearth for the boiling that will come later. The water in the crock is so clear that when you look into it you can see the bottom, the unglazed clay showing through as a pale circle, and the surface is so still that it reflects the rafters overhead. With the water now stored and ready, you step outside once more to rinse the buckets and hang them to dry on the pegs by the door. You splash a little of the remaining water on your face and hands, the cold waking you fully and leaving your skin tingling. The sun feels warm on your damp cheeks, and you tilt your face up to it, closing your eyes for a moment, and letting the light press against your eyelids in a wash of soft red. When you open them again, the world seems washed clean, the colors sharper, the distant sounds clearer. The well trip is a small thing in the grand sum of the day, a task that takes only a fraction of the morning, yet it stays with you as a quiet hum in your muscles and a calm in your mind. You think of the water now resting in its clay crock, drawn from deep underground, where it has filtered through stone and sand for years, now waiting to be heated and steeped with herbs to become part of the beer that will be poured for the village. There is something deeply satisfying in this chain of connection, from rain to earth to well to bucket to brew, and you carry that satisfaction with you as you go back inside to resume the next slow task, the fire crackling in welcome, the morning light angling long across the floor. The water now rests in its tall clay crock, the surface still and clear as a window pane, and the cottage settles back into the quiet rhythm of the morning. You dry your hands on your apron and turn toward the pantry, a small room off the main living space that stays cool even when the sun is high. The doorway is low and you duck slightly by habit as you step through, entering a dim space that smells of dry grain, dried herbs, and the faint mustiness of old wood. The only light comes from a narrow slit window set high in the wall, a shaft of dusty gold that cuts diagonally across the room and illuminates the shelves of clay pots and wicker baskets. In here, the air is still, undisturbed by the breeze that moves through the main cottage, and the temperature is noticeably cooler, the kind of cool that seeps into your skin and makes you glad of your woolen kirtle. On the lowest shelf, near the back wall where the floor is coldest, sits the crock of dried barley grain saved from last harvest. The crock is tall and wide-bellied, glazed a deep brown that looks almost black in the dim light, and it comes up past your knees when you stand beside it. Its lid is a heavy disc of the same glazed clay, fitted snugly onto the rim with a strip of linen, soaked in beeswax pressed between them to keep out moisture and mice. You kneel on the packed earth floor, the coolness seeping through your skirt, and you work your fingertips under the edge of the lid, breaking the wax seal with a soft crackling sound. The lid lifts away, and you set it aside on the floor, leaning it against the wall. The smell that rises from the open crock is the first thing that greets you, a clean, grassy fragrance with a faint underlying sweetness, like a hayfield after the mowing. It is the smell of summer captured in grain, and you breathe it in deeply, letting it fill your head and settle your thoughts. You lean forward and look down into the crock, where the barley lies in a deep golden mass, each kernel pale and plump and faintly glossy. The surface of the grain is uneven, dimpled like the surface of a pond in a light rain, and as your eyes adjust to the shadows, you can see the occasional dark fleck of a leftover husk or the pale curl of a dried stem fragment. You plunge both hands into the grain, and the sensation is immediately soothing, a cool, dry flood of tiny, smooth surfaces sliding against your skin. The barley kernels are firm and slightly slippery, and they flow between your fingers like water made solid. You lift a double handful and let it cascade back into the crock, watching the golden stream catch the shaft of light and sparkle briefly before it merges with the rest. The sound of the grain falling is a soft, shushing hiss, like the wind through dry leaves, and you repeat the motion several times, simply because it feels pleasant, and because the grain shifts and settles a little deeper each time. Now you begin the sorting in earnest. You take up a large wooden bowl from the shelf, a wide, shallow vessel carved from a single piece of beech, its surface worn smooth and its rim darkened by countless uses. You place it on the floor beside the crock, and then you reach into the grain and scoop out a portion, transferring it to the bowl with care, so that no kernels spill onto the floor. The grain in the bowl is easier to examine, spread in a thin layer across the broad wooden surface, and you sit back on your heels and begin to sift through it with your fingers. Your movements are slow and deliberate, your fingertips brushing through the barley in small circular patterns, parting the golden sea to reveal what lies beneath. The impurities are few, but they are there, as they always are. A papery husk, pale brown and translucent, its surface veined like a dried leaf, drifts to the top, and you pluck it out with the tips of your fingers, dropping it into a small discard bowl you have set aside for this purpose. A tiny stem fragment, curved and brittle, snaps under the lightest pressure and joins the husk. You find a small pebble, grey and round and smooth as if it has spent a long time in a stream, and you roll it between your thumb and forefinger before adding it to the discard bowl. The pebble is cold and hard, a small solid thing in a world of grain, and you imagine its long journey from the field to this pantry, carried by a cart and then a sack, and then your own hands. Your fingers continue their slow search, moving across the surface of the grain in overlapping passes like a farmer ploughing a field. The work is hypnotic in its repetition, and your mind quiets further as you settle into the rhythm. You do not count the impurities or track the time. You simply move your hands and let your thoughts drift where they will. The shaft of light from the window has shifted slightly, creeping across the floor by an inch or two, marking the slow passage of the morning. Somewhere in the main room, the fire pops softly, a single sharp sound that fades as quickly as it came, and outside a dove coos its three-note call over and over, a gentle background to your work. When the bowl of grain is clean to your satisfaction, you pour it into a second larger bowl that will hold the measured barley for the brew. This bowl is made of turned oak, dark and heavy, and it sits on the floor beside you, already holding a small amount of sorted grain from your earlier handfuls. You tip the beech bowl carefully, letting the barley slide out in a smooth golden stream, and you use your free hand to guide the flow and catch any last impurities you might have missed. The sound of the grain hitting the oak is deeper than before, a softer thudding that speaks of the wood's thickness, and you find the contrast pleasing. You return to the crock for another portion, and another, each time transferring a manageable amount to the beech bowl and working through it with the same patient care. The discard bowl slowly fills with husks and stems, and the occasional tiny stone, a small collection of things that will be scattered outside later for the birds to pick through. Your fingers have grown dusty with the fine powder that always accompanies grain, a pale floury residue that clings to your skin and makes your hands feel dry and smooth. You rub your fingers together occasionally, feeling the slight grittiness, and the sensation is not unpleasant. As you work, you think about the barley itself, about the field where it grew and the hands that harvested it. Last summer had been warm and dry, the barley standing tall and golden under a sky that seemed to hold its breath for weeks on end. You remember the day the village went out with sickles and scythes, the men cutting the stalks with wide sweeping motions, while the women bundled them into sheaves. You had been there too, your own sickle flashing in the sun, and you recall the ache in your back and the sweet smell of cut grain and the way the chaff stuck to your sweaty arms. The barley had been threshed on the common ground, the oxen walking in slow circles over the spread stalks while the grain fell loose and then winnowed on a windy day when the chaff blew away in a golden cloud. Now that grain is here, in your pantry, waiting to become beer, and the thought gives you a sense of connection that is both ordinary and profound. You finish sorting the last portion of barley and pour it into the oak bowl, which is now more than half full. You brush your hands together to knock off the loose dust, then wipe them on your apron. The discard bowl you set aside on the shelf to be dealt with later. Now comes the measuring, a task that requires a little more attention because the balance of grain to water must be right for the beer to be neither too weak nor too strong. You take down the measuring cup from its hook on the wall, a simple turned beaker carved from a knot of maple, its inside smooth and its outside marked with faint rings left by the lathe. The cup holds exactly what you need, a portion determined by long tradition and many batches of beer. You have used this same cup for years, and it fits your hand as comfortably as a door handle, the wood warmed by your palm. You sit back down on the floor, cross-legged this time, and pull the oak bowl of sorted barley close. The measuring process is as simple as the sorting, but it requires counting, a quiet murmur under your breath that becomes a form of meditation. You dip the cup into the grain, scooping up a level portion, and you hold it over the smaller bowl where you will collect the measured amount. 1, you say, your voice barely a whisper, and you tip the cup, letting the barley pour into the waiting vessel. The grain makes a soft, rushing sound, and the cup empties in a moment, leaving a faint dusting on your palm. You dip again, a second scoop, and then a third, each one followed by a number, murmured so softly that only the walls can hear. 4, 5, 6, the counting continues, and the bowl fills gradually, the pile of measured grain rising in a small golden hillock. You lose yourself in the rhythm of the counting, the dip and pour and murmur becoming automatic, something your body does while your mind floats elsewhere. The numbers flow past like the beads on a rosary, each one a small prayer of preparation. The light from the window has moved again, now touching the edge of the discard bowl and lighting up the husks inside so that they glow like fragments of old parchment. The dove has stopped its cooing, replaced by the more distant sound of a hen plucking somewhere behind the cottages, a sound so familiar that you hardly notice it. When you reach the number you need, you stop and set the cup aside. The bowl of measured grain is full, its surface rounded and smooth, and you look at it with a quiet sense of completion. This grain will become the mash, the sweet wort, and eventually the small beer that will be poured at the feast. The thought is satisfying without being exciting, a calm acknowledgement of the step completed. You stand up slowly, your knees stiff from kneeling on the floor, and you stretch your back with a long, slow motion that makes the joints pop softly. The stiffness is a familiar part of the work, and you welcome it as a sign that you have done something with your morning. You carry the bowl of measured grain out to the main room and set it on the table near the quern, where it will wait for the grinding that comes next. The cottage is warm and bright compared to the pantry, and you blink a few times as your eyes adjust. You check the fire, adding a small log to keep the flame steady, and you dip a cup of water from the crock, drinking it slowly while you stand by the door. The water is cold and good, and it washes the taste of grain dust from your throat. Through the open door you can see that the morning has continued its slow unfolding, the sun now nearly overhead, the shadows shrinking to dark pools directly beneath the trees and walls. The lane is quiet, no one passing, and the whole village seems to be holding its breath in the midday hush. You return to the pantry to tidy up, brushing the stray barley from the floor with a small twig broom and returning the crock lid to its place, pressing it down firmly. The discard bowl you carry outside, scattering the husks and stems and pebbles in a patch of weeds behind the cottage, where the sparrows will find them and pick through the offerings. The pebbles fall with a small clatter. The husks drift down like snow, and then it is done. You stand for a moment in the yard, looking up at the sky, which is now a deep clear blue with only a single cloud drifting slowly toward the woods. The air smells of warm grass and distant flowers, and you feel the sun on your face and arms, a gentle warmth that promises a long, peaceful afternoon ahead. After a while you go back inside, and the cottage welcomes you with its familiar smells of smoke and grain and the faint sweetness of the herbs hanging from the rafters. The bowl of measured barley sits on the table, pale and waiting, and you run your hand over the surface of the grain one last time before turning to the quern. But the grinding is for another chapter of the day, and for now you simply stand in the quiet room, letting the peace of the morning settle over you like a blanket. Your hands smell of barley, your shoulders remember the weight of the water yoke, and your heart beats slow and steady in your chest. The feast is still a day away, the beer still only a possibility, held in grain and water and time, and for this moment there is nothing more you need to do than breathe and be still. The bowl of measured barley waits on the table near the quern, its surface smooth and golden in the midday light that now streams through the open door. You have rested a little, standing in the quiet room, while the fire murmured to itself, and your shoulders no longer remember the yoke's weight. Now the grinding must begin, the slow transformation of whole grain into coarse flour, and you feel a quiet readiness settle over you as you approach the hand mill in the corner. The quern is an ancient thing, passed down through your family until its origins have faded from memory. It consists of two flat stones, the lower one fixed firmly to a low wooden frame, and the upper one balanced precisely on top, pierced through the center with a hole the size of a fist. The stones are a grey-blue granite, speckled with darker flecks that glitter faintly when the light catches them, and their grinding surfaces have been dressed with a pattern of shallow grooves that spiral outward from the center like the petals of a flower. The wooden frame beneath is stout and sturdy, its legs splayed for stability, and its crossbars mortised together with pegs, and a shallow trough carved into the base circles, the lower stone to catch the flour as it emerges. A wooden handle, worn dark and smooth by generations of palms, rises from a socket near the edge of the upper stone, waiting for your grip. You pull up the low three-legged stool that stays beside the quern, settling yourself so that your feet are flat on the earthen floor and your knees are slightly apart, framing the mill. The position is comfortable and balanced, one you have taken countless times before, and your body knows it without instruction. You reach for the bowl of barley and place it on a small shelf built into the quern frame, within easy reach of your left hand, while your right hand falls naturally to the handle. For a moment you simply sit, listening to the cottage sounds, the soft ticking of the fire and the distant murmur of the village, and then you begin. You take a handful of barley from the bowl, letting the kernels cascade from your palm into the central hole of the upper stone. The grain disappears into the darkness, filling the gap between the stones with a soft, rustling sound, and you feel a slight change in the quern's balance as the kernels settle. Then you grasp the handle with both hands and begin to turn, pushing forward and around in a slow, steady circle. The first rotation meets resistance, a grinding resistance that travels up through your arms and into your shoulders, and you hear the sound of the grain cracking, a low crunch that is half sound and half vibration. You continue turning, completing the circle, and then another, and the resistance eases slightly as the broken kernels spread between the stones. The quern's rhythm establishes itself quickly, a steady shush, shh, shh. Ashte beats the corner of the cottage with a soft, continuous whisper. The upper stone rotates in its groove, guided by a wooden peg set into the lower stone center, and the motion is smooth and even once you find the right speed. Too fast, and the flour will heat and spoil. Too slow, and the grain will not break properly. You've learned this speed over years, a pace that matches your resting heartbeat, unhurried and sustainable, and you settle into it as naturally as you settle into sleep. As the stone turns, the first signs of flour begin to appear. A fine pale dust creeps out from the narrow gap between the stones, gathering in the circular trough around the base. It is not yet the flour of the bread baker, white and silky, but a coarse meal, speckled with fragments of husk and tiny broken pieces of kernel. The color is a warm cream, darker where the husk bits cluster, and the smell that rises from it is nutty and sweet, and faintly toasted from the friction of the stones. You pause after a dozen turns and brush the flour from the trough with a small flat wooden scraper, guiding it into a linen cloth spread across your lap. The cloth is coarse and tightly woven, and the meal sits on it in a shallow pile that looks like ground almonds. You pour another handful of barley into the central hole, the grains falling with a soft patter like light rain, and you resume the turning. The handle is smooth under your palms, shaped by the countless hands that came before you, and you can feel the slight indentations where fingers have pressed over generations. Your own hands will leave their mark in time, wearing the wood a little more, but the thought is fleeting and carries no weight. You simply turn, and the stone turns, and the grain becomes flour. The motion of grinding is not one that engages only the arms. As you continue, you become aware that your whole body participates, your shoulders rocking forward and back, your spine twisting slightly at the waist, your legs bracing against the floor to keep the stool steady. It is a gentle full-body rhythm, like rowing a small boat on still water, and after a while the effort fades from your awareness and becomes simply a part of you, as natural as breathing. Your mind drifts while your body works, untethered from the details of the task, and you find yourself thinking about other grindings, other days, other bowls of grain that have passed through this mill. You remember your mother sitting at this same quern when you were small, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm, her face calm and distant. She would sing sometimes, a low song without words that matched the shush-shush of the stone, and you would sit on the floor nearby and watch the flour gather like snow in the trough. The memory is warm and peaceful, and it merges with the present, so that for a moment you are both yourself and the child you once were, linked by the continuous sound of the mill. The quern has been the heart of this cottage for as long as anyone can recall, a steady pulse at the center of the household, and you feel your own heartbeat align with it now. After a time you pause to collect the flour again, scraping the trough clean with careful sweeps of the wooden scraper. The linen cloth now holds a considerable pile, its weight beginning to settle into your lap, and you lift a pinch of the coarse meal to inspect it. The texture is varied, a mixture of fine powder and larger grits, each grit a fragment of barley kernel that still holds its shape. This unevenness is exactly what you want for a small beer, because the mash will steep long, and the hot water will draw sweetness from every size of particle. You rub the meal between your fingers, feeling the slight grittiness, and then you brush your hands clean and reach for another handful of grain. The work continues in this way, a cycle of pouring, turning, scraping, and pouring again, each step flowing into the next without hurry or interruption. The sun moves across the floor in a slow golden pain, and the shadows of the door frame lengthen gradually, but you take no notice of the time. The bowl of whole barley empties by increments, each handful reducing the pile, and the linen cloth fills correspondingly with the ground meal. The sound of the quern is so constant that it fades from your conscious hearing, becoming a backdrop like the rustle of leaves or the distant murmur of a stream, and in that quiet you find a deep and wordless peace. At some point you become aware that the fire needs tending, because the room has cooled slightly despite the midday warmth outside. You stop the quern mid-turn, the stone coming to rest with a soft final crunch, and you rise from the stool, feeling the slight stiffness in your hips from sitting so long. You cross to the hearth, add a split log and a few smaller branches, and stir the embers with the poker until the new wood catches and the flames leap up again. The firelight flickers over the walls, painting the timbers in shifting shades of orange, and the warmth reaches you in a gentle wave. You stand there for a moment, letting the heat soak into your skin, and then you return to the quern and settle back onto the stool. The grinding resumes, and now you notice that the sound has a different quality, a slightly higher note, because the stones have warmed a little from the friction. The granite surfaces expand by fractions invisible to the eye, but your ears catch the change, and you adjust the speed of your turning by instinct, slowing just enough to keep the sound steady. The meal that emerges is a shade lighter now, the kernels grinding more thoroughly against the warmed stone, and you collect it with the same patient care. As the last handful of barley slips from the bowl into the quern, you feel a small sense of completion, not triumph, but quiet satisfaction. You turn the handle through a final series of slow circles, letting the stones clean themselves of the remaining grain, and the sound gradually changes from a grinding crunch to a smoother whisper as the last particles pass between them. You stop turning and lift your hands from the handle, flexing your fingers, feeling the pleasant ache in your forearms and the slight roughness on your palms from the wooden grip. The quern falls silent, and the cottage seems very quiet in its absence, as if the whole room is taking a breath. You collect the last of the meal from the trough, brushing it carefully with the scraper, and then with a small whisk made of bound twigs, getting every last bit. The linen cloth is now heavy with ground barley, a substantial mound of pale, coarse flour that will make the mash for the small beer. You gather the corners of the cloth and twist them together, forming a loose bundle that you carry to the table, setting it beside the mashing tub. The flour will rest there covered and cool until the water is heated and the mashing begins. Before you leave the quern, you take a moment to clean it properly, because stone left with damp flour will sour and spoil the next batch. You fetch a dry cloth from the shelf and wipe the upper stone, the lower stone and the wooden frame, removing every trace of dust and meal. The cloth comes away pale and powdery, and you shake it out the door, watching the fine particles drift away on the breeze like a tiny cloud. Then you take a small brush made of stiff ball bristles and work it into the grooves of the grinding surfaces, dislodging any compacted flour that might linger. The grooves are deep and spiral, and you trace them with the brush in slow, careful strokes, first one direction and then the other, until the stone feels clean and slightly rough to the touch. With the quern cleaned, you replace the bowl on its shelf and set the scraper and brush in their proper places, so that everything is ready for the next time. You look around the cottage, noting the bowl of ground meal on the table, the water crock nearly full, the fire burning steady, and you feel that the day is unfolding exactly as it should. The grinding is done, a task that took patience and time and a certain quiet focus, and now the grain waits in its new form, ready to become something else entirely. You step outside into the yard, stretching your arms over your head and rolling your shoulders to loosen the muscles that the quern has worked. The sun is now well past its peak, sliding down the western sky, and the shadows of the trees stretch long and thin across the grass. The air is warm and drowsy, full of the hum of bees working the clover in the meadow, and from the village green you can hear the faint sounds of hammering as the trestle tables are assembled for the feast. You stand in the doorway, letting the peace of the afternoon wash over you, and you feel no hurry, no urgency, only the slow, steady pulse of the day moving toward evening. After a while you go back inside, pour a cup of water from the crock, and drink it slowly while you look at the bundle of ground meal on the table. Your hands still smell faintly of barley and warm stone, and you press them together, feeling the residual warmth from the grinding. The mashing will come soon, the hot water and the long steeping, but for now you simply rest, sitting on the stool by the hearth and watching the flames dance their slow hypnotic dance. The cottage is quiet, the quern still, and all is well. The bundle of ground barley meal sits on the table, pale and soft inside its linen wrap, and you know the next step is waiting. Mashing is the heart of brewing, the moment when dry grain and hot water come together to release their sweetness, and the process requires attention without urgency. You move toward the hearth where the iron pot hangs from its hook, its blackened sides absorbing the firelight. The water you drew from the well earlier waits in the tall clay crock, cool and still, and you dip a smaller pot into it to fill the iron vessel hanging over the flames. The water pours with a hollow splash, filling the pot by degrees, and you watch the surface tremble and then steady as you pour enough for the mash. The level rises to a mark you know by heart, a dark line on the inside of the pot left by years of brewing, and you stop and set the smaller pot aside. The fire beneath the iron pot has been burning low but steady, and now you add a few more sticks of dry beechwood to build the heat gradually. The wood catches quickly, little flames running along the bark, and the fire's voice changes from a soft murmur to a lively crackle. You adjust the pot on its hook so that it hangs a little lower, closer to the new flames, and then you settle onto a stool nearby to wait. The water begins its slow transformation, and you watch the surface with calm patience, knowing that the right temperature arrives in its own time. Tiny bubbles start to form along the inner wall of the pot, clinging to the iron like seed pearls, and they release one by one to float upward. A thin wisp of steam rises, curling in the air like a question mark, and the kitchen fills with the clean smell of heating water, which is not really a smell at all, but a freshness that makes the room feel newly washed. You test the water's warmth with a method your mother taught you long ago, a method her own mother used before that. You dip your elbow into the pot, because the skin there is sensitive and tells the truth about heat, and you hold it just below the surface for a slow count of several breaths. The water is still too cool, carrying only a mild warmth that is pleasant without being purposeful, so you withdraw your arm and dry it on your apron while the fire continues its work. After a while you try again, dipping your elbow once more and feeling the warmth now deeper, but not yet right, not yet the temperature that will coax the sugars from the grain. The water needs to be hot enough to steep the meal thoroughly, but not so hot that it scalds the starches and makes them seize. You wait and watch the steam thicken, the bubbles now forming a ring around the pot's edge, and on the third test you feel it, a comfortable penetrating heat that makes you pull your elbow back after only a moment. The water is ready and you lift the pot from its hook using thick folded cloths to protect your hands, carrying it carefully across the room to where the mashing tub waits. The mashing tub is a wide vessel of oak, broad and shallow rather than deep, its staves held tight by iron bands that have darkened to the color of old charcoal. You set the hot pot on a stone trivet beside the tub, and then you untie the linen bundle of ground meal, spreading the cloth open so that the coarse flour lies exposed. The meal has settled into a soft hillock, pale cream with darker flecks of husk, and it still carries the nutty scent that rose from the quern earlier. You take a moment to appreciate the feel of it, running your fingers lightly over the surface and breaking up a few small clumps that formed while it rested. Then you lift the hot pot again and begin to pour the water in a slow, steady arc over the grain. The first contact of water and meal is a quiet hiss, a sound that speaks of transformation, and the dry flour darkens instantly to a rich brown. Steam rises in a cloud, carrying the smell of warm bread and toasted nuts, and you pour carefully, evenly, moving the pot so that the stream falls across the entire surface. The meal drinks the water thirstily, swelling and clumping, and you see the individual particles merge into a wet mass that gleams under the steam. When you have poured enough water to cover the grain, you set the pot back on the trivet and take up the long-handled wooden paddle that leans against the wall. The paddle is smooth from years of stirring, its blade broad and flat, its handle worn to fit your grip, and you lower it into the mash with both hands. The stirring begins, and this is the work that will occupy you for a long, quiet while. You push the paddle through the wet grain with a slow, steady motion, circling around the edge of the tub and then cutting across the middle. The mash is thick and heavy, a porridge-like mixture that resists slightly before yielding, and the paddle moves through it with a soft sucking sound. Your arms take up the rhythm, shoulders rocking gently, and you stir and stir, breaking up the clumps of dry flour that hide in the depths, making sure every particle of grain meets the warm water. The steam rises in your face, warm and moist, and you breathe it in, the smell of barley and water and heat filling your head. The cottage around you is quiet, except for the sound of the paddle, a low, wet murmur that rises and falls with each circle, and the fire in the hearth settles into a steady glow. As you stir, the mash begins to change. The coarse texture smooths, the grittiness dissolves, and the mixture becomes more uniform, a thick liquid that swirls slowly in the wake of the paddle. The color shifts from the pale cream of dry meal to a rich golden brown, the color of weak tea or aged honey, and the smell deepens too, growing sweeter and more complex as the hot water draws the sugars from the grain. You can almost taste the sweetness in the steam, a faint promise on the back of your tongue, and you know the mashing is working. The temperature of the mash is crucial now, because too much heat will drive off the delicate aromas, while too little will leave the grain unstripped of its goodness. You have learned by feel over many batches, and your hands know the warmth through the wood of the paddle, a warmth that should be steady and enclosing without ever stinging. After a period of stirring, when the mash is smooth and uniform, you set the paddle aside and let the mixture rest. The mashing tub sits on the floor near the hearth, and you cover it with a thick linen cloth, folded twice, tucking the edges around the rim to hold in the warmth. The cloth is old and soft, bleached by many washings, and it holds the steam close, creating a warm, dark space where the enzymes can do their slow work. This resting period is as important as the stirring, maybe more so, because the grain needs time to give up its sugars, time for the water to seep into every particle and draw out the sweetness that lies locked inside. You settle onto your stool and wait, watching the cloth rise and fall almost imperceptibly with the breath of the mesh beneath. The cottage is peaceful during this waiting. You tend the fire, adding a single log and adjusting its position with a poker until the flames burn evenly. You pour a cup of cool water from the crock and drink it, feeling it soothe your throat, which has grown dry from the steam. Outside the door the afternoon is mellow and golden, the shadows long across the grass, and the sounds of the village are distant and soft. A hammer tapping somewhere, a dog barking once, and then silent. A light breeze moves through the open doorway, stirring the herbs that hang from the rafters, and the dried bundles sway gently, releasing their subtle scents into the room. After a while you return to the mash and lift the cloth. The steam that rises is still warm, and the surface of the mash has formed a slight skin, a thin layer that wrinkles when you touch it with the tip of the paddle. You stir again, this time more gently, folding the mash over itself in slow, languid strokes. The mixture feels thinner now, the grain having absorbed the water and given up its starches, and the paddle moves through it with less resistance. The color has deepened further, a rich amber that glows in the firelight, and the smell is now unmistakably sweet, a honeyed grainy scent that makes you think of harvest fields and warm kitchens. You stir for a while, enjoying the easy motion, and then you cover the mash again and let it rest once more. The second rest is longer than the first. You use the time to prepare the next steps, setting the woven willow strainer basket over a clean collecting tub, and lining it with a coarse linen cloth. The cloth is square and generously sized, its edges hanging over the sides of the basket, and you smooth it carefully so there are no folds or wrinkles where the grain might collect. The collecting tub beneath is solid oak, its inside scrubbed clean and dry, and it sits on the floor below the mashing tub, ready to receive the wort. You check the fire, you straighten the tools on the shelf, you wipe down the table with a damp cloth, and all the while the mash rests under its linen blanket, transforming slowly. When you lift the cloth for the third time, the steam is thinner and the temperature has dropped a little, which is exactly what should happen. You dip a clean wooden cup into the liquid that has separated from the grain, a thin amber fluid that collects along the edge of the tub. You taste it, and the sweetness spreads across your tongue, mild and clean and faintly nutty, the taste of barley transformed. It is not yet beer, not even close, but it holds the promise of beer within it, and you nod to yourself, satisfied that the mashing has done its work. The grain is spent now, its sugars leached into the water, leaving behind the fibrous husks that will be strained away. You stir the mash one last time, a final slow circle, and then you are ready to drain. You lift the mashing tub carefully, its weight substantial now with a wet grain, and you carry it to the straining setup you prepared. the tub is awkward to hold, and you move slowly, your steps measured, until you can set it on a wooden frame that raises it above the collecting tub. With a flat wooden scoop, you begin to transfer the wet grain into the linen-lined basket, lifting each scoopful carefully and tilting it into the cloth. The mash drops into the strainer with a soft plopping sound, and immediately the amber liquid begins to seep through the linen, dripping into the collecting tub below with a steady plink, plink, plink. You work methodically, scooping and pouring, until the mashing tub is empty and all the grain sits in a wet mass inside the strainer basket. The dripping will take time, and you cannot hurry it. You stand beside the tub and watch the wort gather, its color a clear, deep amber, its surface glossy. The smell that rises is sweet and grainy, now with a faint earthy note from the wet husks. You press down gently on the grain with the back of the scoop, helping the last of the liquid to escape, and the drips quicken briefly before slowing again. The afternoon has turned toward evening, the light through the door now golden and slanting, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a task nearly complete. The mashing is done, the sweet wort is draining, and soon the boiling will begin. But for now you stand in the quiet cottage, listening to the gentle sound of liquid dripping into liquid, and you let the peace of the moment hold you still. The woven willow basket sits ready on its frame above the collecting tub, lined with coarse linen that hangs over the edges in soft folds, and you stand beside it with the mashing tub cradled in your arms. The wet grain inside the tub is heavy and warm, a thick porridge that has given up its sweetness to the water, and now it must be separated, the liquid drawn off and the spent husks set aside. You shift your grip on the tub, feeling its weight settle against your forearms, and you begin the slow work of transferring the mash to the strainer. The wooden scoop is a simple tool, a flat blade of beech with a short handle worn smooth by use, and you dip it into the mash with care, lifting a portion of the wet grain. The mash holds its shape on the scoop, a rounded mound of brownish gold that trembles slightly as you move, and you tip it gently into the center of the linen cloth. The sound it makes as it lands is soft and wet, a muffled plop that repeats each time you add another scoopful. Steam rises from the pile, thinner now than when the mashing began, carrying the sweet, grainy scent that has filled the cottage all afternoon. You work steadily, scooping and pouring, while the pile inside the strainer basket grows higher and the level in the mashing tub falls by slow degrees. The first liquid begins to seep through the linen almost immediately. It appears as a darkening of the cloth, a spreading stain that starts at the bottom of the basket and creeps upward, and then the first drops gather on the underside of the linen, hanging like beads of amber honey, before they fall. The drops hit the bottom of the collecting tub with a clear musical note, a plink that echoes softly in the wooden vessel, and then another drop falls, and another, each one distinct and separate. You pause in your scooping to watch the process, because the first draining is always a small moment of satisfaction. The liquid is the wort, the sweetheart of the beer, and its color is a deep, clear amber, like weak tea held up to a candle. It catches the firelight as it falls, each drop briefly illuminated before it merges with the growing pool below. You return to the mashing tub, scraping the sides with the edge of the scoop to gather every last bit of grain. The sound of the scoop against the oak is a hollow scraping, and you work carefully around the bottom curve, collecting the mash that clings to the staves. When the tub is nearly empty, you tip it forward and use the scoop to guide the remaining grain into the basket, and then you set the empty tub aside on the floor. The strainer basket is now full, a wet mound of spent barley husks sitting in its linen nest, and the drips continue their steady rhythm, falling into the collecting tub with a sound like a slow, leaky roof on a rainy night. You take a moment to wipe your hands on your apron, feeling the sticky residue of the mash on your fingers, a faint sweetness that clings even after wiping. Then you turn your attention fully to the draining, because this is a task that requires patience above all else. The liquid must find its own path through the grain and the cloth, and any attempt to hurry it will only cloud the wort with fine particles that should remain behind. You stand beside the tub, your hands resting lightly on the rim, and you watch the drips fall, counting them not with numbers but with the slow rhythm of your breath. The drips are not regular at first, some falling close together and others pausing before they release. But as the minutes pass, the rhythm steadies into something predictable, a heartbeat of liquid that marks the quiet afternoon. The smell of the wort is different from the smell of the mash. Where the mash was bready and thick, the wort is cleaner, sweeter, with a hint of the nuttiness that came from the grinding. It fills the cottage with a gentle aroma that makes you think of warm kitchens and harvest suppers, and you breathe it in deeply, letting it settle into your memory. This is the smell that will carry through the rest of the brewing, the boiling and the fermenting, and finally the drinking, and it connects this moment to the feast to come. As the draining continues, you notice that the flow is beginning to slow. The initial rush of liquid has passed, and now the drops fall more deliberately, each one taking its time to form and release. You lean over the basket and examine the grain, seeing how it has settled into a dense mass, the individual husks compacted together and the surface dimpled where the liquid has drained away. The linen cloth is stained a deep brown, and its folds are wet and heavy. You take the flat wooden board that you use for pressing, a square of beech about the size of a trencher, and you lay it gently on top of the grain. Then you press down with both hands slowly and evenly, not forcing the liquid but encouraging it, and the drips quicken for a moment as the grain gives up more of its moisture. A thin stream runs from the bottom of the basket, darkening the wood of the collecting tub, and you hold the pressure for a slow count before releasing and lifting the board away. The pressing is something you will do several times during the draining, each time extracting a little more liquid until the grain is as dry as it can reasonably become. You take up your position beside the tub again, standing in the quiet cottage while the afternoon light shifts across the floor. The sun has moved further toward the west, and the shadows of the door frame have lengthened, stretching almost to the hearth. The air that comes through the open door is cooler now, carrying the first hint of evening, and the bird's song that was so lively earlier has softened into occasional calls, single notes that hang in the air and fade. While you wait for the next pressing, you attend to small tasks around the cottage, never going far from the draining tub. You check the fire, adding a thin branch of ash that catches quickly and sends a shower of sparks up the chimney. You refill the water pitcher from the crock, the sound of the pouring water echoing the sound of the dripping wort. You take down a bunch of dried yarrow from the rafters, examining the feathery leaves and the small white flowers that have turned brown and crisp with drying, and you set it on the table in readiness for the boiling that will come later. These herbs have waited for months in the dark of the cottage, and soon they will give their bitterness and their preserving qualities to the beer. You return to the basket and press again, this time leaning your weight into the board and holding it longer. The grain yields another small stream of liquid, and the surface of the mash sinks a little lower under the pressure. The wort in the collecting tub is now several inches deep, a pool of clear amber that reflects the rafters overhead like a dark mirror. You lean over and look at your own reflection, a face wavering on the surface, and you can see the steam from the warm liquid rising in faint wisps around your reflected features. The temperature of the wort is still warm from the mashing, but it cools as it sits, and by the time the draining is finished, it will be ready for the pot. The third pressing yields less liquid, and the fourth yields less still. The grain is now a dense cake inside the linen, its color faded to a pale tan, its texture rough and fibrous. You lift a pinch of the spent grain and rub it between your fingers, feeling the husks separate and crumble. They are dry on the outside but still moist within, and you know that a little more liquid remains if you choose to wait for it. You decide to let the basket sit while you prepare the boiling pot, because the last few drips will fall in their own time and the beer will not suffer if the draining is not absolute. You lift the iron pot from its trivet and set it over the fire, adjusting the hook so that it hangs at the right height for a gentle boil. The pot is clean from its earlier use, and you pour a little fresh water into it, swishing it around to rinse any dust, then tip the water out the door. The pot settles onto its hook with a soft creak of iron against iron, and you build up the fire beneath it, adding 2 solid logs and a handful of dry kindling to encourage the flames. The fire responds with a lively crackle, and soon the pot begins to warm, the iron sides radiating a dry heat that you can feel when you hold your hand a few inches away. Now you return to the draining basket for the final time. You remove the pressing board and untuck the edges of the linen cloth, gathering the corners together to form a bundle around the spent grain. The cloth is wet and heavy, and you lift the bundle carefully, carrying it outside to a wooden bucket that sits by the door. The spent grain will not go to waste. It will be taken to the chickens or the pig, who will scratch and root through it with enthusiasm, and whatever remains will be scattered on the garden as mulch. You twist the cloth to squeeze out the last few drops of liquid, a thin trickle that darkens the ground, and then you empty the grain into the bucket, shaking the cloth to loosen the clinging husks. The spent grain looks nothing like the barley you sorted that morning, its golden color gone, its substance reduced, and yet it still carries a faint sweet smell that the animals will find appealing. You rinse the linen cloth in a bucket of clean water, working the fabric with your fingers to remove the sticky residue, and then you hang it over a bush to dry in the late afternoon sun. The cloth drips for a moment and then stills, and a small bird flits down from the thatch to investigate the wet fabric before flying off again. You pick up the strainer basket and rinse it too, splashing water through the woven willow until it runs clear, and you set it upside down on the grass to drain. The tools of the day's work are now clean and drying, and the only thing that remains is the wort itself, waiting in its tub. You go back inside and lift the collecting tub carefully, carrying it to the table, where the light from the door falls across it. The wort is beautiful in its simplicity, a deep, clear amber liquid that glows when the sun touches it. You dip a clean cup into it and lift a small portion, holding it up to the light. The liquid is transparent but not colorless, holding a depth of gold that shifts as you tilt the cup, and a few tiny particles drift slowly through it, fragments of grain that escape the straining and will settle out during the boiling. You taste the wort again, and it is still sweet, still mild, but now there is a slight astringency at the back of your tongue, a hint of the husks that will be balanced by the herbs you will add later. The draining is complete, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a task properly finished. The cottage is tidy, the tools are clean, the fire burns steady beneath the waiting pot, and the wort sits ready in its tub. Outside the afternoon has turned fully to evening, the sun now low and golden, the shadows long and blue, and the air has that particular stillness that comes before dusk. You stand in the doorway and look out at the village, at the smoke rising from the other chimneys, at the rooks circling above the elm tree, at the distant figures moving slowly on the green where the feast tables stand half assembled. The world is peaceful and orderly, and you are a part of it, a small part doing a small task in a long chain of tasks, and that is enough. You turn back to the cottage and lift the collecting tub once more, carrying it to the hearth where the iron pot now hangs with a shimmer of heat rising from its sides. The wort will go into the pot soon, and the herbs will be added, and the boiling will begin. But for now, you simply set the tub on the stone trivet and let the liquid rest. There is no hurry, no need to rush from one step to the next. The brewing follows its own rhythm, and you follow it too, as you have done many times before and will do many times again. The feast is tomorrow, the beer is on its way, and the evening settles over the cottage like a gentle hand. The collecting tub of sweet wort sits on the stone trivet near the hearth, and the iron pot hangs above the fire with a shimmer of heat rising from its blackened sides. You have come to the boiling, the step that will transform the raw sweetness of the grain into something more complex, something with depth and structure and the faint bitterness that makes beer refreshing rather than cloying. The fire has been building for a while now, fed with dry beech logs that burn hot and clean, and the pot is ready to receive the liquid. You lift the collecting tub with both hands, feeling the weight of the wort shift inside it, and you carry it carefully to the hearth. The surface of the liquid trembles as you walk, catching the firelight and throwing it back in wavering patterns, and you set the tub down on the hearthstones while you adjust the pot's position on its hook. The iron is hot enough that you can feel the warmth radiating against your face when you lean close, and you use a thick, folded cloth to steady the pot as you begin to pour. The wort flows from the tub in a smooth amber stream, splashing softly into the iron vessel, and the sound is deeper now than it was in the collecting tub, a low resonant note that speaks of the pot's thickness and the fire beneath. You pour slowly, steadily, until the last of the liquid has been transferred, and then you set the empty tub aside and wipe a few stray drops from the rim of the pot. The wort sits calm and dark in the iron pot, its surface glossy and still, and you watch it for a moment as the heat begins to penetrate. Tiny bubbles start to form along the inner walls, the same way they did when you heated the mashing water, and they release one by one to float upward and vanish. A thin wisp of steam rises, curling in the air, and the smell of the wort intensifies, the sweetness becoming more pronounced as the temperature climbs. You settle onto your stool beside the hearth, the wooden paddle resting across your knees, and you wait for the boil to begin. While you wait, you turn your attention to the herbs. On the table near the door, you have laid out the small bundles you gathered from the rafters earlier, and now you bring them closer to the hearth where the light is better. The dried yarrow is feathery and light, its leaves reduced to thin, brittle strands that crumble at the edges, and its small white flowers have turned brown and papery with drying. You pick up a few stalks and crumble them gently between your fingers, releasing a faint bitter scent that is clean and medicinal, like the smell of a meadow after mowing. Yarrow has been used in brewing for generations, adding a subtle bitterness that balances the malt sweetness and helping the beer to keep longer in the cask. Beside the yarrow sits a small linen pouch tied with string, and you loosen the knot and peer inside. The pouch contains a handful of grains of paradise, a peppery spice that comes from far away, brought by merchants who travel the rivers and roads. The grains are small and round, reddish-brown, and they look like tiny seeds. When you crush one between your thumb and forefinger, it releases a warm, spicy aroma that is sharp and floral at the same time, with a hint of heat at the back of the nose. Only a few grains are needed for a batch of small beer, just enough to add a gentle warmth without making the drink spicy. You measure out a small portion onto a wooden spoon, counting under your breath, and then you return the rest to the pouch and tie it closed. The third herb is sweet gale, which grows in the boggy ground beside the stream that runs along the edge of the common pasture. You gathered it last summer, wading into the wet grass with your skirts tucked up, pulling the fragrant branches from the low shrubs that grow there. The dried leaves are grey-green and covered with a fine down, and they smell of resin and pine, and something floral that is hard to name. Sweet gale adds a gentle bitterness and a clean, sharp scent that lifts the whole brew, and it was your grandmother's favourite addition to small beer. You take a few dried sprigs from the bundle, stripping the leaves from the woody stems with a soft rustling sound, and you set them aside with the yarrow and the grains of paradise. The herbs need to be contained during the boiling so that they can be removed cleanly later, and you prepare a small linen square for this purpose. The cloth is clean and fine, a leftover piece from making your apron, and you spread it flat on the table and pile the herbs in the center. The yarrow goes first, its feathery fronds settling into a soft mound, then the grains of paradise scattered across the top like tiny seeds, and finally the sweet gale leaves laid in a neat layer. You gather the corners of the cloth and bring them together, twisting them into a tight bundle, and you tie it securely with a length of kitchen string. The bundle is small and neat, about the size of a hen's egg, and it feels light in your hand, a little sachet of fragrance and bitterness. By now, the wort has begun to simmer. You can see the surface trembling, and a ring of fine bubbles has formed around the edge of the pot. The steam rises in thicker columns, carrying the sweet grainy smell into the rafters, and you stand up and lean over the pot to watch the transformation. The simmer is not yet a full boil, just a gentle movement that sends small ripples across the surface, and you wait a little longer, letting the heat build gradually. A full rolling boil would be too violent for small beer, driving off the delicate aromas and making the final drink harsh, so you watch carefully and adjust the pot's height on its hook, raising it slightly to moderate the temperature. When the simmer has steadied into a soft, continuous motion, not quite bubbling, but nearly there, you drop the linen bundle of herbs into the pot. It lands with a small splash and bobs on the surface for a moment before the liquid soaks through the cloth and it begins to sink. You use the wooden paddle to push it gently under the surface, holding it there until it stops floating, and then you let it settle to the bottom where it will steep as the wort simmers. The herbs begin their work immediately, and you can smell the change in the steam, the sweetness now cupped with a faint herbal sharpness that is clean and green. You take up the paddle and begin to stir, a slow, gentle motion that keeps the liquid moving without splashing. The paddle moves through the wort with ease, much easier than it moved through the thick mash earlier, and the liquid swirls around it in a languid spiral. The stirring helps to distribute the herb's flavor evenly through the pot, and it also prevents the wort from catching on the hot iron bottom. You stir in long, slow circles, watching the steam rise and the firelight play across the surface, and you feel the rhythm of the work settle into your bones. The boiling will continue for a good while, long enough for the herbs to give up their bitterness, and for the liquid to reduce slightly, concentrating the flavors. You do not measure this time with a clock, because there is no clock to measure it with, but rather by the look and smell of the wort and by the gradual shifting of the light outside. The sun has dropped below the tree line now, and the sky through the open door is a wash of pale gold and soft pink, the colors of a late summer evening. The birds have quieted, except for a single thrush singing its evening song somewhere in the elm tree, a series of clear notes that repeat and vary and repeat again. You stir and watch, watch and stir, and the cottage grows dimmer as the evening deepens. You pause to light a tallow candle, touching a splint to the fire and then to the wick, and the small flame catches and steadies, adding its warm yellow glow to the firelight. The shadows in the corners deepen, and the rafters disappear into darkness, but the area round the hearth is bright and warm, a small circle of light that holds you and the pot and the stirring paddle. The smell of the boiling wort continues to change as the minutes pass. The raw sweetness of the mash has mellowed, and the herbs have woven themselves into the aroma, creating something balanced and complex. The yarrow adds a dry, meadowy note, the sweet gale brings a resinous, piney sharpness, and the grains of paradise contribute a subtle warmth that you feel more than smell. Together they transform the wort from something simple into something layered, and you breathe in the steam with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the beer will be good. After a while, you notice that the liquid has reduced slightly, its level a little lower in the pot, and the color has deepened to a darker amber. This is the sign you have been waiting for, and you use the paddle to fish out the herb bundle from the bottom of the pot. The linen is stained brown and dripping, and you set it on a small dish to cool, where it will be squeezed later to extract every last bit of flavor. The herbs inside have given up most of their character to the wort, and what remains is a spent mass that smells faintly of its former self. You taste the wort again, dipping a clean spoon into the pot and blowing on the hot liquid before sipping. The taste is different now, no longer simply sweet, but balanced with a clean bitterness that lingers at the back of the tongue, and the spices add a gentle warmth that spreads down your throat. It is not yet beer, because the yeast has not been added, and the fermentation has not begun. But it is no longer just grain and water either. It has become something in between, a promise that is already starting to be fulfilled. You lift the iron pot from its hook, using both hands and the thick folded cloths to protect your palms, and you carry it away from the fire. The pot is heavy, and you move slowly, setting it down on the stone trivet, where it will begin to cool. The boiling is done, and the liquid now needs to lose its heat gradually, coming down to the temperature of a warm bath before the yeast can be added. You leave the pot uncovered for now, letting the steam rise freely into the cottage, and you add a small log to the fire to keep the room warm as the evening cools. The spent herbs in their linen bundle have cooled enough to handle, and you pick up the bundle and squeeze it over the pot, extracting a few final drops of concentrated liquid. The drops fall into the wort with a soft patter, and then you untie the string and open the cloth, spreading the spent herbs on a wooden board to dry. They will be added to the compost pile tomorrow, returning to the earth that grew them, and the cloth will be washed and stored for the next brewing. The cottage is quiet now. The only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the village settling into evening. You stand by the door and look out at the darkening sky, where the first stars are beginning to appear, pale points of light in the deepening blue. The air is cool and still, and it carries the smell of wood smoke and new-mown hay. You feel tired in a pleasant way, the kind of tiredness that comes from a day spent working steadily at tasks that matter, and you know that sleep will come easily when the time arrives. But there is still the cooling to attend to, and the yeast to add, and the long quiet fermentation that will work through the night. You turn back to the pot of wort, touching the iron side with the flat of your hand, feeling the heat still radiating strongly. The cooling will take its own time, as everything in brewing does, and you are content to wait. You pull your stool closer to the hearth, pick up a small piece of mending that has been waiting in a basket, and settle in for the quiet evening hours, the pot of wort steaming gently beside you as the day slowly becomes night. The boiling is finished, and the iron pot sits on the stone trivet inside the cottage, its contents still trembling with the memory of heat. You look at the dark amber liquid, watching the steam rise in thin curling ribbons, and you know that the next step asks for patience of a different kind. The wort must cool before the yeast can be added, because yeast is a living thing that thrives in warmth but perishes in heat, and the right temperature is the warmth of a mild afternoon or a comfortable bath. You touch the side of the pot with the back of your hand, feeling the heat radiate strongly, and you decide that the cooling will happen outside, where the air moves freely and the shade of the old elm tree offers a natural shelter. You prepare to lift the pot, folding 2 thick cloths and placing them on the table within reach. The pot is heavy with liquid, and the iron holds the heat fiercely, so you wrap your hands carefully with the cloths, tucking the ends into your palms to protect your skin. You bend your knees and take hold of the pot's handles, one on each side, and you lift with the slow, steady motion that comes from your legs rather than your back. The pot rises from the trivet, and you feel the full weight of it pulling down through your arms and shoulders, a solid burden that makes you take small, deliberate steps. You turn toward the door, moving with the careful concentration of someone carrying something precious, and the floorboards creak under your weight as you cross the threshold into the open air. The yard outside the cottage is quiet and golden, the late afternoon sun slanting low through the branches of the elm. The tree stands just a few paces from the door, an ancient presence with a broad trunk and a crown of serrated leaves that shimmer and rustle in the lightest breeze. Its roots have pushed up the earth around it in gentle hummocks, and a large flat stone rests among them, placed there by someone long ago as a step or a resting spot. The stone is grey and smooth, its surface worn by weather and use, and it stays cool even in the hottest part of the day, because the elm's shade never leaves it. This is where you will set the pot, and you walk toward it with slow, even steps, feeling the heat of the iron pressing through the cloths, and the weight shifting slightly with each footfall. You lower the pot onto the stone, bending your knees again and setting it down with a soft clunk that resonates through the iron and into the ground. The stone accepts the weight without shifting, and you straighten up and release your grip, flexing your fingers inside the cloths. The steam from the pot rises in a thick column now that it is in the cooler air, and you watch it curl upward and dissolve into the dappled light beneath the elm. The leaves above filter the sun into shifting patterns of gold and green that play across the pot's blackened sides, and the breeze that moves through the yard carries the steam away in gentle drifts. You go back inside the cottage and fetch a clean linen cloth, a square of fabric that you use only for covering the cooling wort. It is fine and closely woven, bleached by many washings to a soft cream color, and you shake it out as you walk back to the elm. Draping it loosely over the top of the pot, you let the edges hang down over the rim without tucking them in, so that the steam can still escape, but any drifting leaves or curious insects will be kept out. The cloth settles into place, and the steam now filters through it in a diffuse cloud, the fabric moving slightly with the breath of the hot liquid beneath. You stand for a moment beside the pot, looking out across the yard to the lane and the village beyond. The afternoon is mild and drowsy, the kind of weather that makes the bees slow and the birds quiet. From somewhere down the lane you can hear the distant tap of a hammer, perhaps the wheelwright still at his work, and the occasional lowing of a cow in the byre. The air smells of dry grass and warm earth, and the faint resinous scent of the elm leaves. You feel the tiredness of the day settling into your limbs, a pleasant heavy feeling that makes you want to sit down and be still, and so you do. There is a low wooden bench against the cottage wall, placed there for moments exactly like this, and you brush off a few dry leaves and settle onto it with a long exhale. The cooling will take time, and you are in no hurry. The yeast waits in its small crock in the pantry, a living culture that you have kept alive through many bakings and brewings, and it will be ready when the wort is ready. You lean your back against the warm cottage wall, and let your gaze wander across the familiar shapes of the yard, the water buckets hanging on their pegs, the chopping block with its scatter of wood chips, the row of clay pots by the door where you grow kitchen herbs. The elm's leaves rustle overhead with a sound like distant water, and a pair of sparrows flit through the branches, their wings making a soft whirring noise. The world feels spacious and calm, and the pot sits on its stone like a patient creature, breathing its steam into the afternoon. After a while, when the first heat has passed and the steam has thinned, you rise from the bench and approach the pot. You lift a corner of the linen cloth and peer inside, seeing the surface of the wort now dark and still, no longer quivering with the boil. A few wisps of steam still rise, but they are faint now, and the smell that reaches you is the balanced aroma of malt and herbs, sweet and bitter and green all at once. You take up the long wooden spoon you brought from the cottage, its handle smooth and its bowl worn thin by years of stirring, and you lower it into the liquid. The spoon moves through the wort with ease, and you begin to stir in a slow, gentle circle, watching the liquid swirl and the last of the steam rise in a small puff. The stirring helps the heat escape, bringing the cooler liquid from the bottom to the surface, and it also keeps the wort from developing a skin on top. You stir for a short while, the motion lazy and unhurried, and then you withdraw the spoon and lay it across the top of the pot, letting the cloth fall back into place. You return to the bench and settle in again, this time with a small basket of mending that you brought from inside. There is a tear in one of your aprons, a long straight rip where the fabric caught on a nail, and you thread a needle with sturdy linen thread and begin to sew. The needle slips in and out of the fabric with a soft popping sound, and the rhythm of the stitching matches the slow pace of the afternoon. Your hands know this work without thought, and your mind drifts as you sew, touching on small memories and idle observations. You think about the feast tomorrow, about the faces of the neighbors you will see, about the children who will run between the tables and the old men who will tell their stories. You think about the beer now cooling under the elm, and you imagine the taste of it on a warm afternoon, cool and mild and slightly bitter. The thoughts come and go without urgency, like clouds crossing the sky. The sun has moved noticeably by the time you look up again, its golden light now coming from a lower angle and painting the yard in long shadows. The elm's shadow has stretched across the grass, and the pot now sits in a patch of dappled light that shifts with the leaves. You set aside your mending and stand up, feeling the stiffness in your back from sitting, and you walk over to the pot again. This time when you lift the cloth, the steam is gone entirely, and the surface of the wort is calm and glossy. You dip the spoon in and stir once more, feeling the resistance of the liquid, and then you touch the side of the pot with the back of your hand. It is still warm, but the sharp heat has faded, and the iron is now merely comfortably hot, like a stone that has sat in the sun. The cooling is progressing, and you estimate that the wort will be ready for the yeast by the time the sun touches the horizon. You remove the cloth entirely for a moment, letting the open air have full access to the liquid. The breeze that moves through the yard is cooler now, carrying the first hint of evening, and it ruffles the surface of the wort into tiny ripples that catch the light. You breathe in the clean smell of the cooling brew, and you notice how the aroma has mellowed even since the boiling ended, the sharp edges softening, the herbs blending more fully into the malt. It smells like something that is almost ready, and the thought brings a quiet anticipation. A few leaves from the elm drift down as you stand there, spinning lazily in the air, and one of them lands on the rim of the pot. You pick it up, a perfect serrated oval of green touched with yellow at the edges, and you toss it onto the grass. Then you replace the linen cloth, draping it loosely as before, and you go back to the bench. This time you do not pick up your mending, but simply sit and watch the yard, letting the peace of the evening wash over you. The light continues to change, the gold deepening to amber, and the shadows grow longer and softer. A robin hops across the grass near the well, cocking its head and listening for worms, and its red breast flashes brightly in the low sun. The cow in the byre has fallen silent, and the hammering from the lane has stopped. The village is settling into its evening quiet, and you feel yourself settling with it. After another interval, you rise and test the wort again, this time dipping your finger quickly into the liquid. The temperature is now just above body warmth, a mild heat that feels pleasant rather than hot. It is almost ready, but not quite. The yeast prefers a temperature that is warm but not hot, a gentle embrace rather than a fire, and you know that another short wait will bring it to the right point. You leave the cloth off now, letting the last of the heat escape into the cooling air, and you walk a slow circle around the yard, stretching your legs and looking at the small details of the garden. The kitchen herbs in their pots are thriving, the sage and thyme and marjoram all sending up new shoots, and you pinch a leaf of marjoram and crush it between your fingers, releasing its sweet spicy scent. The sun is now a golden disk just above the tree line, and the sky behind it is streaked with pink and pale orange. The first star has appeared in the east, a single point of light in the deepening blue. You decide that the wort is ready. You lift the pot from the stone, using the cloths again, even though the iron has cooled considerably. and you carry it back inside the cottage. The walk is easier now, the pot lighter, without the fierce heat radiating from it, and you set it down on the table near the hearth where the fire has burned low. The cottage is warm and dim, the tallow candles still burning on the shelf, and the familiar smell of wood smoke and dried herbs welcomes you back. You fetch the small crock of yeast from the pantry, a pale foamy balm that you have been saving from your bread making, and you set it beside the pot. The yeast is alive, a soft bubbly mass that smells faintly sour and yeasty, and you stir it with a small wooden spatula to wake it up before you add it to the wort. But the adding is for the next chapter, and for now you simply stand in the quiet cottage, the pot of cooled wort waiting on the table, the yeast ready in its crock, the whole day's work behind you, and the night's quiet fermentation ahead. You feel a deep sense of calm, the kind that comes from a day spent in slow and steady labor, and you are content to let the evening unfold at its own pace. The elm tree stands dark against the sunset sky outside the door, and the first crickets are beginning their evening song, a soft chorus that will accompany the night. You are ready for the next step, but you are also ready to simply be still for a moment longer, and so you stand and you breathe, and the cottage holds you in its quiet warmth. The cottage is dim and warm, the fire settled into a bed of glowing coals that breathe orange and fade and breathe again. The pot of cooled wort sits on the table, its surface dark and still, and beside it rests the small crock of yeast that you have brought from the pantry. This is the moment when the brew receives its life, the invisible transformation that will turn sweet liquid into beer, and you approach it with the same quiet care you have given to every step that came before. The yeast crock is a small earthenware vessel, no bigger than a drinking cup, with a glazed interior that keeps it clean and a rough unglazed exterior that stays cool to the touch. You lift the lid, which fits loosely to let the culture breathe, and you look inside at the pale foamy balm that has been waiting in the darkness. The yeast is alive, a soft, bubbling mass the color of new cream, its surface dimpled with tiny pockets where gas has risen and escaped. The smell that reaches you is faintly sour and yeasty, like bread dough just before it goes into the oven. And underneath that there is a clean sharpness that speaks of fermentation. You have kept this yeast alive for many months, feeding it with a little flour and water each week, and it has repaid you by raising your bread and brewing your beer with faithful regularity. You take a small wooden spatula, a slim blade of beech that you use only for this purpose, and you stir the yeast gently to wake it from its resting state. The balm deflates slightly under the spatula, releasing a puff of air that carries the sour yeasty scent more strongly, and then it begins to foam again as the yeast cells respond to the disturbance. You stir for a short while, breaking up any thick patches and making the consistency even, and then you set the spatula aside and turn your attention to the pot of wort. The wort is cooled to the right temperature, a warmth that you test by dipping your finger briefly into the liquid. It feels like a comfortable bath, warm but not hot, the kind of temperature that invites rather than repels. The yeast will thrive at this warmth, waking fully and beginning its slow work of turning sugar into spirit, and you know from long experience that the timing is right. You lift the yeast crock and hold it over the pot, pausing for a moment as if making a small offering, and then you tip it forward and let the balm slide out in a creamy ribbon that coils across the surface of the wort. The yeast floats for a moment, a pale island in the amber sea, and then it begins to spread and sink, sending thin, cloudy tendrils down into the liquid. You take up the long wooden paddle, the same one you used for the mashing, and you lower it into the pot. The stirring is gentle now, a slow circular motion that draws the yeast down into the wort and distributes it evenly through the liquid. The paddle moves through the pot with a soft, swirling sound, and you watch the pale yeast clouds spiral and disperse, merging with the amber until the whole surface looks uniform. The smell changes as you stir, the clean sweetness of the wort now mingled with the yeasty sharpness of the balm, and the combination is promising, a hint of the beer that will come. You stir for a dozen slow circles, making sure no pocket of yeast remains undissolved, and then you lift the paddle and let it drip back into the pot before setting it aside. The fermentation vessel waits in the corner of the cottage, a wooden barrel that you have prepared in advance for this moment. The barrel is not large, standing about waist high, its oak staves held by iron hoops and its inside scrubbed clean with hot water and dried in the sun. It smells faintly of old oak and the ghost of previous brews, a clean woody scent that promises to add its own subtle character to the beer. The barrel has a wide bung hole at the top, sealed now with a loose wooden plug, and a small tap hole near the base that is stopped with a turned peg. You lift the pot of wort, which is still warm and now alive with yeast, and you carry it across the room to where the barrel stands on its wooden cradle. Pouring the wort into the barrel requires care, because the liquid is heavy and the opening is not large. You use a wide-mouthed funnel that you carved yourself from a hollow piece of elder wood, its opening flared to catch the pour and its stem narrow enough to fit the bunghole. You set the funnel in place and then lift the pot, tilting it slowly so that the wort flows in a steady stream. The liquid gurgles through the funnel and splashes into the barrel with a deep hollow sound, and the steam rises briefly from the opening before dispersing. You pour until the pot is empty, catching the last few drops with a shake, and then you set the pot aside on the floor. The barrel is now full, the wort resting inside it in the darkness, and you remove the funnel and set it on the table to be cleaned later. You take up the wooden plug and set it loosely into the bunghole, not sealing it tightly, but letting it rest there so that the gas can escape as the yeast begins its work. The fermentation will produce a steady stream of bubbles, carbon dioxide rising from the liquid, and if the barrel was sealed tight, the pressure would build until something gave way. The loose plug allows the gas to escape while keeping out dust and insects, and it will rock gently in its hole as the pressure pushes upward, making a soft tapping sound that you have come to associate with the quiet days of fermentation. The barrel now sits in its corner, dark and still, and you kneel beside it for a moment, listening. There is no sound yet, because the yeast is only just beginning to wake, but you know that within a few hours the first bubbles will rise and the slow transformation will begin. You place your hand on the oak staves, feeling the cool, smooth wood and the faint vibration of the liquid inside, and you think about the invisible work that will happen while you sleep. The yeast cells are already feeding on the sugar, multiplying and growing, and by morning the surface of the wort will be covered with a thick foam, a sign that the fermentation is strong and healthy. You rise and attend to the small tasks that follow the pitching of the yeast. The pot is carried outside and rinsed with water from the bucket, the last traces of wort splashing onto the grass where the insects will find them. The paddle is wiped clean with a damp cloth and hung back on its hook. The yeast crock is scrubbed with a twist of straw and set aside to dry, and you save a small portion of the balm from the bottom of the crock, transferring it to a clean vessel and feeding it with a pinch of flour so that the culture will continue for next time. These tasks are simple and repetitive, and you perform them with the ease of long habit, your hands moving while your mind rests. The cottage has grown darker as the evening has deepened, and you light another tallow candle from the embers of the fire, touching the wick to a glowing coal and watching the flame catch and steady. The candlelight pushes back the shadows, illuminating the barrel in its corner and the table with its scatter of tools. You pour a cup of water from the crock and drink it slowly, standing by the door and looking out at the night. The sky is now fully dark, scattered with stars that shine with a clear, cold light, and a crescent moon hangs low over the tree line, its pale curve reflected faintly in the dewing grass. The air is cool and still, and the only sound is the distant call of an owl from the woods beyond the common pasture. You close the door but did not bar it, leaving a small gap at the top for the smoke to escape and the fresh air to enter. The fire has burned down to embers again, and you add a final log, a thick piece of oak that will smoulder through the night and keep the chill away. The barrel will ferment best at a steady temperature, neither too cold nor too warm, and the cottage with its thick walls and banked fire will hold the right warmth until morning. Before you settle in for the night, you kneel beside the barrel one more time, leaning close to the bunghole. And there it is, the first faint sign of life. A tiny bubble has risen to the surface and burst, releasing a minuscule puff of air that carries the yeasty scent more strongly. You listen, and after a long silence you hear another bubble rise, a soft plink that is more vibration than sound. The yeast is working, the fermentation has begun, and you feel a quiet gladness that the brew is on its way. You replace the loose plug and rise, brushing the dust from your knees. The night stretches ahead, hours of darkness filled with the slow, steady work of the yeast, and you are ready to let it happen without your supervision. You undress slowly, hanging your kirtle on its peg and folding your apron, and you wash your face and hands in a basin of cool water, feeling the day's work lift from your skin. The bed in the corner is simple but comfortable, a straw mattress on a wooden frame with a woolen blanket and a pillow stuffed with goose feathers. You lie down and pull the blanket up to your chin, feeling the tiredness settle into your bones, a deep, pleasant ache that comes from a day well spent. The candle flickers on the shelf, and the barrel breathes softly in its corner, and you listen to the occasional plink of a bubble rising, a sound that will accompany your dreams. The last thing you see before sleep takes you is the faint glow of the embers reflected on the ceiling, a warm orange light that pulses softly with the draught, and the last thing you think is that tomorrow the beer will be ready, the feast will begin, and the village will drink and be glad. But that is tomorrow, and tonight there is only the quiet cottage, the working yeast, and the slow drift into sleep. The morning of the feast arrives with a sky full of pale gold clouds, the kind that drift slowly and casts soft shadows across the fields. You wake without urgency, your eyes opening to the grey light of early dawn filtering through the small window and the gap beneath the door. The fire has burned down to white ash during the night, and the air inside the cottage is cool, but not cold, holding the faint, yeasty smell that has been developing for the past day and night. You lie still for a moment, listening, and the first sound you hear is the soft plink of a bubble rising through the fermentation barrel, a sound so familiar now that it feels like the heartbeat of the cottage. The yeast has been working all through the night and the day before, turning the sweet wort into small beer, and now the brew should be ready. You rise slowly, pushing back the woolen blanket and feeling the cool earthen floor against the soles of your feet. Your body is rested, the pleasant tiredness of the brewing day now faded into a comfortable ease, and you move through the morning rituals with calm deliberation. You stir the embers and coax a new flame from the ash, feeding it straw and twigs until the fire catches and the warmth begins to spread. You wash your face and hands in the basin, the water cool and refreshing, and you dress in your clean kirtle and apron, the ones you set aside for the feast day. The linen is smooth and smells of the sunlight it dried in, and you tie the apron strings with a sense of occasion. The barrel stands in its corner, dark and patient, and you approach it with the quiet anticipation of a craftsperson checking their work. The loose plug in the bunghole has been tapping gently all night, lifted by the pressure of the fermenting beer, and now it sits still, the vigorous fermentation having subsided into a slow, quiet finish. You lean close and listen, and the bubbles rise now only occasionally, a soft plink every few heartbeats, telling you that the yeast has done its main work and the beer is settling into itself. You remove the plug entirely and set it aside, and the smell that rises from the barrel is mild and clean, slightly tart with the memory of yeast, but mostly the balanced aroma of malt and herbs, a gentle beer that promises refreshment without heaviness. You fetch a hollow reed from the shelf, a long tube of elder wood that you use for drawing samples from the barrel. The reed is smooth and pale, its pith pushed out long ago to leave a clear channel, and you lower it carefully into the bunghole, dipping it just below the surface of the beer. You place your thumb over the top end to trap the liquid, then lift the reed and release the contents into a small wooden cup. The beer flows out in a thin amber stream, and you hold the cup up to the light from the door. The color is a clear, pale amber, like weak tea or aged honey held to the sun, and the surface carries a thin ring of fine white foam that fades as you watch. The liquid is slightly hazy, not yet fully settled, but the haziness will clear as the day goes on. You lift the cup and taste, and the small beer slides across your tongue with a mild sweetness balanced by the clean bitterness of the herbs, the yarrow and sweet gale and grains of paradise, all present but subtle, and underneath everything there is a slight tartness from the fermentation that makes the drink feel alive. It is good, a gentle, everyday beer that will quench thirst and settle well in the stomach, and you nod to yourself with quiet satisfaction. Now comes the work of drawing the beer from the barrel and preparing it for the feast. You gather your equipment, the clay jugs and stoppered bottles that you have collected over the years, each one scrubbed clean and dried and waiting on the shelf. The jugs are of different sizes and shapes, some tall and narrow, with small loop handles, others round-bellied with wide mouths, all of them glazed in earthy browns and greens. The wooden plugs that seal them are carved from offcuts of oak and beech, each one fitted to its specific jug, and you check them all to make sure they are clean and dry. You set the largest jug on the floor beside the barrel and take up the hollow reed again, along with a second smaller reed that will serve as a vent. The drawing process is simple but requires a steady hand, because you want to take the beer from the top of the barrel where it is clearest, avoiding the layer of yeast sediment that has settled at the bottom. You lower the reed into the beer, watching it disappear into the amber liquid, and you position the tip just below the surface. Then you place your mouth on the upper end and give a gentle suck to start the flow, a quick pull that brings the beer rushing up the hollow channel, and you quickly direct the stream into the waiting jug. The beer splashes into the clay vessel with a soft gurgling sound, and the foam rises briefly before settling into a thin white cap. You fill the first jug nearly to the top, leaving a small space for the plug, and then you lift the reed to stop the flow, pinching the end with your thumb. The beer inside the jug is a beautiful clear amber, and you hold it up to the light, seeing how the sun catches the liquid and makes it glow. You press the wooden plug into the neck, tapping it gently with the palm of your hand until it seats firmly, and then you set the fill jug on the table. One down and several more to go. The second jug fills the same way, and the third, each one receiving the same careful attention. You work steadily, drawing the beer from the barrel and filling the jugs one by one, and the level in the barrel drops slowly as you go. The sediment at the bottom remains undisturbed, a pale layer of spent yeast that has done its work and now rests, and you are careful not to dip the reed too deep. The sound of the beer flowing is a constant gentle music, a soft splashing gurgle that fills the cottage, and the smell of the fresh beer mingles with the wood smoke to create a pleasant homely atmosphere. When all the jugs are filled, you count them on the table, a neat row of clay vessels, each one sealed with its wooden plug. There are enough to serve the village, enough for every family to have a cup or two, and the sight of them lined up gives you a feeling of readiness. The barrel still holds a small amount of beer at the bottom, too cloudy with sediment to serve at the feast, and you will leave that to settle further and use it for cooking in the days to come. You replace the plug in the bung hole and cover the barrel with a cloth, and then you turn your attention to the jugs. You have a large wicker basket with a sturdy handle, the kind used for carrying goods to market, and you line it with a thick bed of clean straw. The straw is golden and sweet-smelling, saved from the threshing floor, and you arrange it in layers to cushion the jugs and keep them from knocking against each other. You lift each jug carefully and place it in the basket, nestling it into the straw, and you arrange them so that the weight is balanced and the basket will carry easily. The last jug goes in, and you tuck more straw around the tops to hold everything steady, and then you stand back and look at the loaded basket. It is a simple thing, clay and straw and wood, but it represents the work of 2 full days, and you feel a quiet pride that has nothing to do with boasting. The morning outside has grown brighter, the pale gold clouds now thinning to reveal patches of clear blue sky. The sun is warm but not hot, a perfect summer day for a village feast, and the air that comes through the door is fresh and clean. You can hear the sounds of the village waking more fully now. Voices calling, a cart rumbling along the lane, the distant bleat of sheep being moved to a new pasture. The feast will begin when the sun is high, and you have time to carry the beer to the green and set it up before the first hungry neighbors arrive. You lift the wicker basket by its handle, testing the weight, and it is substantial but manageable. You can carry it the short distance to the green without help, and you prefer to do it yourself, to deliver your contribution with your own hands. You step out into the yard and pause to close the cottage door behind you, latching it loosely, and then you begin the walk along the lane toward the village green. The basket sways gently with each step, and the jugs clink softly against each other inside their straw nest, a muted pottery sound that is pleasant rather than alarming. The lane is busier than it was on the morning you drew water from the well. Neighbors are out and about, walking in the same direction, carrying their own contributions to the feast. You see the baker's wife with a tray of small loaves covered by a linen cloth, and the miller with a crock of butter wrapped in wet leaves to keep it cool. The carpenter carries a bench on his shoulder, and two boys run past him laughing, their bare feet slapping on the packed earth. Everyone is moving toward the green, and you join the slow procession, nodding at familiar faces and receiving nods in return. The atmosphere is one of quiet anticipation, the kind that comes when people have worked hard and are ready to rest together. The village green opens out before you as you round the last bend in the lane, a broad expanse of close-cropped grass that has been tended by sheep through the summer. The long trestle tables have been set up in 2 rows, their wooden planks supported on trestles and their surfaces scrubbed clean. Linen awnings have been stretched above them, tied to poles and flapping gently in the breeze, casting a soft white shade over the eating area. Benches and stools have been brought from every cottage, and they stand in uneven rows along the tables, waiting for people to fill them. At one end of the green, a fire pit has been dug, and a pig is roasting slowly on a spit, turned by a young man who watches it with a patient expression. The smell of roasting meat drifts across the green, mingling with the scent of fresh bread and cut grass. You carry your basket toward the far end of the tables where the drinks are being arranged. A small table has been set aside for you, the same one every year, and you set the basket down on the grass beside it with a sigh of relief. You unpack the jugs one by one, lifting them from the straw and arranging them on the table in a neat row. The sun catches the glazed surfaces and makes them gleam, and the wooden plugs stand upright like little sentinels. You set out a row of simple wooden cups, turned from beech and worn smooth by use, and you fill a large pitcher from one of the jugs so that the first pour is ready when the feast begins. The small beer sits in the pitcher with a thin cap of foam, and a few people who are already on the green glance over and nod appreciatively. The feast begins slowly, as village feasts always do, with people drifting onto the green in 2s and 3s, finding their places, greeting their neighbors. The old men sit on the benches in the shade, their sticks leaning against the tables, and the women gather in clusters to talk and arrange the food. The children run through the grass, their high voices carrying on the breeze, and the dogs follow them with wagging tails. You stand behind your table and pour cups of small beer as people approach, handing them out with a quiet smile. The first cup goes to the carpenter, who drinks deeply and wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, pronouncing it good. The second goes to the baker's wife, who sips more cautiously and nods with approval. And then more people come, and your hands grow busy with the pitcher and the cups, pouring and handing, the rhythm settling over you like a familiar song. The sun climbs higher, and the feast unfolds in its gentle way. The food is laid out on the tables, platters of roasted meat, and baskets of bread and bowls of fresh butter, and pots of preserved fruits. People serve themselves and each other, passing dishes along the tables, and the talk is low and friendly, punctuated by occasional laughter. The small beer flows steadily from your jugs, cup after cup, and you watch the faces of your neighbors as they drink, seeing the refreshment in their eyes. The beer is cool from sitting in the shade, and it slides down easily, leaving no heaviness behind, and you hear several people remark that it is just right for a warm day. The afternoon passes in this peaceful manner, the sun moving across the sky in a slow arc, the shadows of the awning shifting on the grass. Children grow tired and fall asleep on blankets spread under the elm tree. The old men tell stories of harvests past, their voices droning in the warm air. The pig on the spit has been carved down to the bone, and the bread baskets are nearly empty. Your jugs have diminished too, the level of beer falling with each pour, and you estimate that there is just enough left to serve the last few cups before the feast winds down. When the final jug is empty, you set the pitcher aside and sit down on the bench behind your table, feeling the pleasant tiredness in your feet and the satisfaction of work completed. The beer has been drunk, the village has been served, and the brewings began 2 days ago with a bowl of dry barley has reached its quiet conclusion. You look out across the green at the faces of your neighbors, the people you have known all your life, and you feel a sense of belonging that is as warm and steady as the summer sun. The feast will continue into the evening, and there will be songs and stories around the fire when the stars come out. But for now there is only the drowsy afternoon, the soft hum of conversation, and the taste of small beer on your tongue. You pour a final cup for yourself, the very last of the brew, and you sit in the shade and drink it slowly, savouring the mild bitterness and the clean finish. The beer is exactly what it should be, a drink for a village feast, a drink for a warm afternoon, a drink that will be remembered fondly when the tables are cleared away and the green returns to its quiet self. You have done your part, and the day is good, and the sun continues its slow descent toward the tree line while the village rests in the golden light.